Brother Stephen, a prospect of mud flows, and we have had some already.
Prime Minister Gonzalez, the aid that is coming in, is it getting to the people who are in need? That has always been a question.
I would say overwhelmingly so. You will have hiccups, some cases that some persons, for one reason or the other, haven't received. But I would say overwhelmingly, we must integrate what we do at home with our regional institutions and our global partners.
We have to understand, and we accept as a business community, we accept, look, yes, there has to be the restriction. But the point is, we are saying, don't just give restrictions. Along with restrictions, let's have vaccinations.
Discussions on health, leadership, governance, crime, education, and social justice every Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m. The Citizens Community Forum. Your host, Stephen Cummings.
Let me welcome our guests. I would let our listeners know who those persons are momentarily as we begin our program for this evening. Well, you know, it's another day when we focus on some of the issues that affect us all in Trinidad and Tobago, whether there be issues of for social nature, education, health, even politics, as it were, so that this is just one of those programs that we sort of span the many issues that affect us. But I want to say that it's important that we discuss these issues because by so doing we are able to learn from one another, and it adds to that to that richness in terms of concepts and so on, so that we are able to grow and be a better society, us here in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, this evening inside the Citizens Community Forum, we are discussing, and our topic is the state of education in a pandemic. Now, there continues to be criticism about our education system, and one key question has been raised as to whether or not our educators or even policymakers have been using the right models. Some analysts have blamed what they believe would have been an education system that has led to systemic dysfunctionality, social inequality, and even injustice. Now, we have a pandemic that has forced the education system to reinvent itself in a new digital age, which brings with it many uncertainties as to where we are going as a people. Now, I read 2 reports from the World Bank where it said that school closures due to the COVID-19 pandemic risk pushing an additional 72 million primary school-aged children, including those in the Caribbean, into what it calls learning poverty. With that as a backdrop, it also means that a large percentage of students will not reach university level, which is in itself creates a new social issue. Now, the Washington-based financial institution said that the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the global learning crisis that had already existed. The bank said the pandemic could increase the percentage of primary school-aged children in low and middle-income countries, such as those in the Caribbean, living in learning poverty to 63% from 53%, and it puts this generation of students at risk of losing about US $10 trillion in future lifetime earnings. It adds that this amounts to an equivalent of 10% of the global gross domestic product, GDP. The World Bank also, in a report, outlined the need for urgency in having a new vision for learning, saying that heavy investment, concentrated policies, including education technology, must be part of a new trajectory, especially for vulnerable countries. One of the fundamental questions as well is whether our present education system is producing the kind of citizens we want. Also, whether the current model is even a contributory factor to social injustice and violence. And I also looked at a report from UNICEF where it says that severe acute childhood malnutrition in Haiti, for example, is expected to more than double this year amid the pandemic, along with rising crime. It says more than 86,000 children under the age of 5 could be affected compared to 41,000 last year. Haiti is said to be the poorest country, categorized as one of the poorest countries in the Americas, and more than 60% of its population live in poverty. Now, this evening inside the Citizens Community Forum, our topic is the state of education in a pandemic. And joining me via Zoom is Dr. Paulson Skerrit. Dr. Skerrit is a lecturer in the area of reading education in the School of Education, Faculty of Humanities and Education at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Dr. Skerrit is the reading specialist on PIDEC's operating committee, and a main focus in his research agenda is reading education and reading intervention for struggling readers. Dr. Skerrit also has a Master of Science in Deaf Education and a doctorate in Literacy Studies, Reading Education. We also have Dr. Krishna Seunarinesingh, a lecturer teaching in English at the School of Education, UWI St. Augustine. He has been at the university since 1999, previous to which he was a secondary school teacher of English. Dr. Seunarinesingh is broadly interested in promotion, we are told, of adolescent literacy, but specifically interested in improving students' reading and writing skills by helping teachers find more effective ways of teaching. And his most recent research work looked at the improvements that occurred in teachers' writing instruction when they used the self-regulated strategy development approach to teaching writing. So we have two guests on our program this evening inside the Citizens Community Forum, and let me first welcome Dr. Skerrit. Dr. Skerrit, good evening to you and welcome again.
Thank you, it's nice to be here.
And welcome Dr. Seunarinesingh.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and I must say welcome to all of the guests who are tuned into our program today.
Right, thank you again. Dr. Seunarinesingh, this is your first installment, so I have to give you a special welcome. I know Dr. Skerrit was on with us on a previous occasion. We have a lot to unpack this evening, gentlemen, and we're talking education in a pandemic, and we, as I said, suffice it to say, there's a lot to unpack this evening. One of the fair questions to ask is, which I think is a good place, where we can start, is what is the level of contribution regional universities are making towards arresting the risk factors associated with education in a pandemic? Now, there is some anecdotal evidence that since March 2020 to present, Trinidad and Tobago would have lost an estimated 45% of the secondary school population due to many issues, a lack of internet connectivity, devices, and simply, inability to understand the full concept of what is called blended learning. Dr. Seunarinesingh, maybe I can start with you. What's happening now in terms of, on the university side, in terms of contributing towards treating with some of the issues that we are faced with at this time?
Okay, so thank you very much and welcome to all our viewers and listeners. So to deal directly with the issue you've raised, and let me say that the way that you introduced the issue was painted a really bleak picture of what we are facing, but unfortunately, the future is probably going to be bleaker than that. All of the research that we've looked at, which emanates from, let's say, US and UK, from places that have come out of the lockdowns because of the presence of vaccination, that sort of thing. So they have come out before we have, and the evidence so far is not good. Right, it is the bleak picture that you paint. What has the University of the West Indies been doing as, the premier university in the region? Well, it's not just in School of Education. University-wide, for example, we know that there are faculties that have been engaged in outreach. So I'm not talking here about outreach merely to recruit new students. I'm not talking about that kind of outreach to say, okay, so these are our programs. That's not outreach, right? That's just trying to get new clients, new customers. what we've been doing is that we know that there are, for example, in Faculty of Humanities and Education, we know that people of staff, colleagues have put on webinars and seminars for CAPE students, for CSEC students, in a move to address their content gaps, if you will, help them to understand the content that they're supposed to be tested on, assessed on, with the delayed start to examinations. So we know that that's been happening in Faculty of Humanities and Education and in Social Sciences. So it's been directly in terms of meeting the students' needs. At School of Education, we have targeted or directed our efforts at teacher, because we are a teacher education school.
Yes.
We've been working with teachers to try and get them better prepared, better equipped to use the technology that the Ministry of Education has provided to schools. So there was a bit of a lapse whilst we all struggled to equip ourselves with the skills and the tools for online learning.
Yeah. Learning curve. There has been a learning curve. Yes.
Yes, it was. For some, it was more steep. It was steeper than others. but yes. University staff included. But what we have done at School of Education is that we have concentrated our efforts on teachers, providing professional workshops, especially for example, our teachers who are in training. We reach out to them, we try to prepare them for working in this online environment. It's not been blended. It's been completely online, and unfortunately, it's taking long. All right, it's taking long. But let me put this into perspective, because you prefaced all of this by talking about the alarmingly large numbers of children who have fallen off the boat. And up till last week, talking to my secondary school teachers, we know that in the rural schools, for example, in one rural school, I have a teacher who teaches all the Form 1s. She's supposed to have 72 or 73 kids in all the Form 1s. She says only between 16 to 18 of them come online at any given time. Right? Sometimes children have access to the laptops, they have access to the internet, but they do not come online. So on the one hand, we're making provision for access, but it's not always being met with the receptivity that we would expect. All right? Yeah.
So there's an issue there. Even though you have the system being provided, you're saying that the reciprocal, you don't always have the same measure of response.
No, we don't. We don't always have. And that's one of the more alarming things. I'll be using this word alarming throughout this because
that's quite okay.
Because quite frankly, we are scared. We are very, very scared, and we're trying to transmit that to our teachers, because the fact is that what we are facing before us could be a disaster, and it's difficult to quantify it. All right, so let me put it into perspective. We know that the pandemic has had inequitable effects. So the kids who come from the middle and higher socioeconomic backgrounds, their parents are well-to-do and that sort of thing, it's not affecting them as much as it's affecting the kids who come from poorer households.
Yes.
And the children who attend schools that are equipped, the children who attend schools that are traditionally considered prestige schools, are almost all online. Almost all. Everybody I talk to in those schools, their kids are online. Right?
And therein lies the inequity that I referenced earlier on in the discussion. But let me bring Dr. Skerrit into the conversation. Right. Dr. Skerrit, can you is it that you'd want to add to what Dr. Seunarinesingh has said? Because I know that you also have concerns about where we are and that learning gap. Students who are not accessing the system for one reason or the other. We are in a difficult place. Dr.
Yes.
Skerrit.
Definitely. I am, like Dr. Seunarinesingh mentioned, very pleased with some of the efforts the university made. Right away, when we closed the university, very quickly, because put on a program to train some of the lecturers. Thankfully, at the School of Education, many of us were already teaching online. We had blended programs. And we had welcomed those of us who had come out of university gung-ho to use the technology, integrate the technology appropriately. So unlike my previous employment in Trinidad, I didn't have those kinds of blocks. We're trying to embrace the integration of technology. So I was glad when
you had an easier learning curve, Dr. Skerrit, is it?
Yes. And we had
Fortunately, yes.
Yes. So one of the nice things are our directors of education, both the former director, Dr. Yamanali, and particularly the current director, Professor Delisle, very much forward moving in his thinking. He focused on the educational technologists in our department, making sure that our department was beefed up so we could get the training. The university, through SETTLE, our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, they made available a quickly developed program to train our lecturers in the use of technology, use of software, how to engage our tertiary education students. And as Krishna mentioned, we really tried to ensure that those teachers we're training would be up to date with those skills so that they can pass that on to their peers. And then, of course, at the end of their training, they'll be sure to bring that to help address the learning gap that we face. Something else that we've done, as you know, the last time we were on the program, we talked about PEDIC or PDIC as our dean, and I'd really like to mention the support we've gotten from our dean, Dr. Heather Cato, and from our principal, Professor Copeland, who recognized the role of the underserved and the need to address their needs in marginalized population, because as Krishna mentioned, they're the ones who particularly are being affected now. And so that disparity in learning, disparity in reading achievement, and as a foundation to educational achievement is going to be a greater challenge for the marginalized, for the underserved, those coming from poorer households, rural settings. So PEDIC, we shifted our focus now to the recovery, to learning recovery post-pandemic, and recognizing that it needs to involve two things: targeted intervention and sustained intervention. Yes. Targeted because children are coming from different homes, different needs, different schools that were, as Krishna mentioned, already had resources and could have addressed the students' needs or continue to address it, and schools that didn't have those resources and therefore were in a much worse situation. So those students need specific kinds of interventions, levels of interventions. And so at PEDIC, we've been beefing up our assessment and capability and our intervention to really address those needs.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very, very important interventions at that. Now, this means that, I'm also seeing where there's a need for what I would call a clinical study on our student population, because we don't know where many of them are at this time. And I saw a report which called for even parents to be held accountable for the large percentage of learning loss. Let me go back to Dr. Krishna Seunarinesingh. Do you think that that's a harsh, too harsh approach to take?
Yeah, I would find it difficult to stomach something like that, such a recommendation to hold parents to account, because we have to consider the levels at which parents operate in our society. We have some parents who must be out of their homes continuously to earn an income, and during the pandemic they had virtually no choice but to leave kids at home. If the kids were old enough, they will leave them unsupervised, I suppose, or under the guidance of somebody who was close by. How can you hold that parent accountable if they have to earn a livelihood, right? On the other hand, you have parents who worked from home. They had the wherewithal, they had the computers, they had the internet, and they could work from home and they can supervise their children.
Yes.
All right? But they're trying to supervise so you had teachers, for example, who were working from home. They were teaching other people's children, their students, but they were also responsible for supervising their own kids. That's a very different situation from somebody who is going to hop off to work and go work in a gas station or work in a store or work in a factory. Those are completely different life situations.
Yes.
I don't know that it is fair, ethical to hold a parent to account in a situation like that. Mm-hmm. The other thing too is that remember, parents are not professional educators. All right? We do know, I mean, I suspect that part of the reason people are calling for this is because they know that parental intervention plays a large role in school success. Yes?
Yes.
We know for a fact that every year kids read like 500,000 to 1 million words in their textbooks. The average learners acquire about 3,000 or so new words every year. The ones who are better learners, making more progress, learn about 5,000 words. The kids who come from homes where the parents take a very active interest will learn 5,000 words. Mm. The ones who do not have that kind of background support will learn less. And that is going to be one of the biggest problems we have going forward. Because these children have been out of school since March last year, March 2020. So this is 1 year plus. All right, 1 year plus. Lots and lots and lots of work has been missed. I don't know that you can blame parents for that. Honestly, I don't.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you're listening to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings, and we are talking state of education in a pandemic. I have with me Dr. Skerrit and Dr. Seunarinesingh, both of the University of the West Indies, specialists in their own right in terms of education. Now, I know that we have, you did mention, Dr. Skerrit, about having sharing with us a PowerPoint presentation, which we probably can entertain in a short while. But before we do that, I would say that not every person without an education is living in extreme poverty, but most of the extremely poor do lack a basic education, and poverty have many roots. But among the many causes of global poverty, one factor stands out: education. And I'm seeing where there is a linkage, a direct linkage between education and poverty. And I also referenced the situation there in Haiti. And this is something that I believe, I'm wondering if we are really looking at education and putting education where it should rightfully be, on top of the agenda. Dr. Seunarinesingh, do you care to respond to this?
Okay, so in our national budget for the last couple of years, education, I believe, you can correct me, I think education has received the lion's share of the budget, national budget. Significant part of that budgetary allocation, I believe, however, goes into salaries and infrastructure and that sort of thing, right? There is no question that education needs to be at the forefront. A lot of that needs to go into teacher training, not necessarily provision of devices. I mean, the thing is that since the pandemic situation arose, everybody's been talking about access to devices, access to internet. Anecdotal evidence suggests that yes, it is important, but it may not be the solution. There is no question about the importance of education in terms of poverty alleviation. I mean,
yes.
That has been, that we have known that since the 1960s, since we became independent.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all of the education planners who came before us recognized the importance for a developing country to marshal its human resources, and that, we've seen that in terms of the physical infrastructure. All of the schools that were built, the investment in teacher training, the expansion of the university, that has been important. What has happened, however, is that we have had this relatively large number of people in the lowest socioeconomic group, which has not shrunk as a result of education, has not shrunk to the extent that we would have liked it to. When you got universal secondary education, for example, the intention was because that was a part of the Education for All global movement. The intention was to bring children who had been previously left out of the traditional education system into universal education. Everybody was supposed to get mandatory education up to age 16. The problem is that we have been bringing children into secondary schools who are unprepared for secondary school because they're leaving primary school, many of them unable to function at primary school level. So at age 11 plus, they are not quite ready. They're not reading, for example, at 11 plus. They don't have the mathematical literacy for 11 plus. And that speaks to a relatively weak structure somewhere in the primary system, something that we have been struggling to address, right? And it is concentrated in particular educational districts.
Yeah, so of course the demographics are also there as to where the problem exists.
Yes. A lot of it is in rural areas. You see, what is horrible is the fact that if we had looked at this, you had asked me this question 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have given you the same answer I'm giving you now. And that to me is is tragic.
Yes. So we have not. So Dr. Seunarinesingh, so the needle has not shifted. Too much.
Not as much as we would have liked to. We have built schools in a lot of the areas, rural areas, and we have had returns. We do have returns, but the returns are not as much as we would like. And sometimes, unfortunately, those reasons are outside of the control of school. Because, you were talking about the current model, we talked about the violent context we live in, we talk about the value system and all of that. And some of those reasons for poverty, actually, to be blunt, cannot be addressed by a school.
All right. So it's a whole of society approach.
Yes.
The whole of Dr. Skerrit, let me bring you back in. You did mention that there was a PowerPoint presentation you wanted to share with us. Is that ready at the moment?
Yeah.
You can go right ahead if that presentation is ready.
I need to be allowed to share.
Yes, and please talk us through.
I need to be allowed to share though.
Yes, you can go right ahead.
Not yet. I'm just getting blocked still.
Yes.
So while I keep checking to see if I can share, I will talk through some points. So Krishna made a very good point. So before we spend a lot of money in education, however, I still can't share. Yeah. However, the same report you mentioned talked about the fact that not only are we supposed to have more investment in education, in more of the poorer countries, there's a greater moving away toward investing in education. The developed countries are spending more money, but the poorer countries, developing countries, they're getting cuts in education. I know in our own local context, those leaders in education have been complaining that their budgets are reduced. They're struggling to decide now which of the for example, the interpreters for the deaf in schools. I understand there's a challenge with contracts for them, and so we have deaf children, bright deaf children. We've done so much to train teachers to improve the quality of teaching provided for deaf children who there's nothing wrong with their minds. They have cognitive issues, but they have a language barrier, and the language barrier is solved with interpreters as one way, and there was a challenge with providing contracts with interpreters. Deaf people had to complain that they may not have interpreters for their children.
Okay.
So that's a big issue that we're not willing and we're thinking that because we have a fallout economically because of the pandemic, budget cuts for education is one way to go, but that is not going to solve the situation. I still can't share Mr. Cummings, host disabled participants quit sharing. So as I mentioned earlier, there has to be both tailored and sustained support to allow us to catch up after the pandemic. And it has to be a whole school, whole student approach. So it's called the whole school, whole community, whole child model. And that involves with the community ensuring that children's health education, physical education, nutrition services, health services. Students during the pandemic have been deprived of a lot of those things. Counseling, psychological, social services, social and emotional climate. So those are critical factors. Community, same physical environment, employee wellness, family engagement, community involvement, and of course, coordinating policy, process, and practice. Because sometimes we have policies, we have a lot of very good policies, as Krishna mentioned.
Yes.
A lot of time they get packed up on a shelf, and government after government comes, and those good policies, you know, we have new things coming up, but they end up going back on the shelf. But you might have a policy, but it doesn't translate to practice.
Okay, yes, and implementation.
Or in the process.
Yes.
And that could be a challenge. So the whole child, whole school, whole community, that is critical to addressing the needs of students. Another interesting point that I found, school closure, of course, has impacted education. So there's a loss of learning. We're talking about that.
Indeed.
You mentioned declines in post-secondary enrollment, both academic and TVET areas. And so an increase in the socioeconomic skills gap. But it's also an impact on the physical, mental, and social development and well-being of our students. And
Indeed.
those things
Indeed,
have to
yes.
be addressed
Yes.
with our students being home.
Yeah, there's a there's a socio-psychological impact as well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, Dr. Skerrit, because you know I had also a discussion with Dr. Thello from the Ministry of Health. She is Director of Mental Health, and I did pose that question directly to her. What is the social cost? You know, at the end of all of this, have we really done a clinical study? Yes, we have a pandemic, and there's also the argument, Dr. Skerrit and Dr. Seunarinesingh, that we may have another pandemic coming.
Yeah, I mean that's really important. Now, I'm just reflecting on what we've done at UB. PEDIC, one of the things we've done, we're not just targeting reading intervention. We have our psychological, social services that we've really been paying attention to, because we know that addressing the well-being of students has to have that holistic approach, both in terms of addressing their health issues, their cognitive issues, the social issues, psychological issues, and of course, the reading. So I know just listening to the reports from our manager, who really focuses on the psychosocial services we offer. We've really been addressing that is a big need for it. And of course, the reading intervention services that we've been beefing up.
All right, gentlemen, we are closing, you know, close to that 30-minute halfway mark into the program. This is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings, and I have with me Dr. Krishna Seunarinesingh. We also have Dr. Paulson Skerrit, both of the University of the West Indies, and we are talking the state of education in a pandemic. Gentlemen, we have to take a short break now, and we will come back momentarily. Hopefully, Dr. Skerrit, when we come back, we might be able to get your PowerPoint presentation. Let's hope that the technology is kind to us. So thank you, gentlemen, and we will be back shortly.
Thank you.
Safe. Whether you are in your car, listening to our soul-stirring worship music, at your workspace, being ministered by the word of our ministers, or reaching out daily for prayer from our intercessors, FBN Isaac stands with you as we share in your relationship experience. We're doing it safe. FBN Isaac presents its new online TV package. Pastors and ministers, you can now stream your message on our radio and social media platforms simultaneously. Tap into our wide audience locally, regionally, and internationally to get your message across. Isaac 98.1 FM, the #1 family station. Meet the people where they are at home. Connect with your audience in a safe environment. Call David at 782-6506 or email info@isaac981.com for more information. It's FBN Isaac's new online TV package. Get on board and connect today.
Do you have a business that you want advertised on social media? The Family Focused Broadcasting Network has a special offer just for you. With over 42K followers on all social media platforms, at Isaac the Promise, you're sure to get a boost for your business. With prices as low as $100 for only $250, you can get a customized flyer created by our social media team. Special price package for all church media ministries. Contact us today. Have your business flyer or video posted on all FBN and Isaac social media platforms. Contact us today for more info at 622-8981, Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or email info@isaac981.com.
And welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. We are continuing our discussion on the state of education in a pandemic. And we have with us both from the University of the West Indies. We have Dr. Paulson Skerrit and we have Dr. Krishna Seunarinesingh talking with us on the topic, the state of education in a pandemic. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum.
Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Cummings.
Yes. Dr. Skerrit, I'm not sure if we were able to sort out that little glitch there in terms of your presentation.
No, I think you have to allow me to share. It's a setting that you have to...
All right. Well, all right. I'm sure we can probably sort that out, at the appropriate time, because we wouldn't want to have too much of a challenge with the technology to be switching from one from one platform to the next, but certainly I would invite you to have that presentation so that we can share with our viewing and listening audience. Sure. So we were talking about a number of issues before we went to the break, and we saw where education as we have it today is plays a very, very important part in terms of our socio-economic development. We've seen where there have been numerous reports about learning loss and deficiencies and so. But I wanted to get a sort of direct perspective, Dr. Seunarinesingh, on Trinidad and Tobago. We've referenced Haiti and other parts of the Caribbean, and I know that the university is a regional institution, but more specifically, if you have to give an assessment of the education system in Trinidad and Tobago, how would you assess us in terms of our policy and how we have been able to adapt to the changing environment?
Okay, so you put me in a nice hot seat there. So in terms of our ability to adapt to the changing environment, I think that we are in a relatively good space. When I say, the operative word here is relative, because we have to consider where we are developmentally, the resources that are available to us as a small island state, the kind of technological advancement that's available in other places, and the kind of challenges larger, more well-resourced countries have faced, right? So, for example, now I don't want to downplay what's happening here, but when the pandemic first became a pandemic, everyone was expecting the more developed economies to, not have much trouble to transition because of the wealth that's widespread and, the standard of living, that sort of thing. And then people suddenly realized, hey, wait a minute, it's not as great as we think it is. So large, well-organized education system, Netherlands, Western Europe in general, Canada, the US, suddenly, and even the UK suddenly realized that things weren't as great as they thought they would be. And those places spend billions and billions on education system. We have much less resources, way less resources. There are some things I believe that we have been able to address. There are some things that we depend upon others for. and that we have not been able to respond to it. Now, some of the things that we recognized very early that we needed closing the gap in was obviously because of the transition to completely online. We had to get the devices, we had to get internet connectivity.
Yes.
The problem is that you don't say today, I want to get internet connectivity for 60,000 people, and it happens next week Monday, right? We are none of us wizards. You don't say, I need 60,000 tablets or laptops, and then somebody weighs a wand and you get it tomorrow. That doesn't happen, right? That's
it's not the kind of mathematics that you know.
Yes, you know. And even if you exhaust the supply of everybody who sells those devices in Trinidad, you can't give that to everybody, you know. So the first phase, I think, was trying to figure out what's the need, where is the gap. Then we had to figure out, well, how do we procure all of these devices? How do we get access for people who have no access? That takes time. I obviously do not have the information about if there were holes that we fell down that we should not have fallen into those holes. I don't know. What I do know is that these things take time. I do know that in the process of our acquiring the infrastructure to deal with the major issues, that lots of people have fallen into the holes. They're not cracks anymore. They're fallen into the holes. All right. Between March last year, March 2020, and September or August 2020, remember, we had a whole lot of kids who were going to exams. They were unprepared. They didn't have direct contact with the teachers. Children went to SEA, you know, and there's a whole heartache about that. So, did we have the right policies to deal with that? I don't know that we could have had different policies, honestly. I don't know that the people who are sitting on top could be accused of not caring about people. That's the first thing people say, you know, you don't care about people, you don't care about poor people. Yeah. I mean, honestly, if I am in a position to supply you with 60 or 80,000 laptops, can I do that in 2 weeks or 2 months? I can't. So unfortunately, we have had the fallout of that. Those who did not have access to those devices and to connectivity suffered. That was predictable. A lot of predictable things happened and are going to happen. I don't know that it is from want of policy. I know that the Ministry of Education, for example, made humongous efforts to train teachers and to use its existing capacity. I know that is factual. I was a member of a committee, for example, that looked at the learning management system. Ministry of Education invited me to look at it, to overhaul it.
Yes.
If possible, we made recommendations. It's not that people are sitting around doing nothing, okay? We are all in this thing. I mean, I think everybody, Mr. Cummings, I think everybody knows that Trinidad and Tobago is a small space. We have finite land resources, and we have the same number of people. And if we do not do well by our people, we are all going to suffer. I don't think that we can point fingers at people and blame people, and I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. So, as far as I'm aware, the policies that were possible to be put in place were put in place. However, the lag time between wanting something and getting it has been long.
All right. So
that has been long.
So that there has been a lag, and that has probably contributed as well to our situation as we have it. Now, Dr. Skerrit, the promotion of standards, in education, do you believe that we have been doing our fair share in terms of importing standards? Because there's a discussion now about we talk about the CXC and the CSEC, and there's this whole discussion now with the assessment process and how you assess and whether one standard of assessment is superior to the other, and the business of the promotion of standards of education. Do you have any a recommendation as to where we should be going, and maybe even our policymakers?
Good question. So I know that conversations at the Ministry of Education and other levels, benchmarking is something that has been looked at, looking at those countries that have been doing well in certain areas and trying to see if we can apply some of what they're doing. Of course, we always have to contextualize that to our own culture.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
Relevant. We can't just wholesale adopt standards from outside. But there have been an effort to look at those countries that we can benchmark and draw. For example, there's some countries where they've had the same challenges with their poorer students struggling, but they were sure that the school could compensate for that. So even though you had students who, those poorer schools, students coming from poorer communities, poorer homes, they ensure that the education system kind of level the playing field, provide equitable access.
Yeah.
But of course, the problem is, while we might have very good policies, one of the challenges we don't have a lot the laws that require that certain things be put in place for students, that they have to be there. And because those laws are there, even though we are signatories to conventions like the United Nations Rights and for Persons with Disabilities and so many other conventions, we have students who are struggling with different challenges, whether it's health, cognitive, sensory impairments, etc. But because the laws aren't there, you don't have an application of the things we have in policy throughout the system. And so we have, and that impacts standards, because the laws will inform the policies, and then the policies will inform the standards. And so we'll have the standards moving toward the process and then the actual implementation in the system. Something you mentioned earlier, and we have to be very careful as we look at the matter of standards, is how do we react to the pandemic? Because now that we have a fallout economically, people are concerned about tests and making sure the students can perform well in tests. And what happens, especially for the poorer students, is that the reaction is, let's narrow the curriculum. Let's just focus on what they need to get them to pass.
Yes.
And so some of the more important things, like with those same boys who are underachieving, we have this negative discourse that boys aren't doing well, but that's not the case. Oftentimes, all of the research, all of the studies we looked at up to this year, and that we discussed in some of the webinars that the School of Education put on with regard to boys underachievement, it's not just all boys. There's greater intra-group disparity. So within the boys, we're finding a lot of disparity. Within the girls, we're finding a lot of disparity, rather than the traditional gender bias, gender issues, gender narrative that girls are doing better. Some of the recent research is saying that when the girls come in, they're coming in very early in school with an advantage, but with formal instruction, there's a leveling, the boys are catching up. The problem is that there's sometimes when we move toward doing something, we tend to, somebody is polarized into this approach. Let's look at single-sex schooling. Let's look at, we need more male teachers, but it's an intersecting of a number of things that has to be looked at. Sorry. And that's really critical to providing the targeted interventions. Boys are underachieving, but they need, you can't have that narrowed curriculum for them. They need to have books that they're interested in. They need to come up with interventions like readers' theater. Reading is at the base of achievement in all of the subject areas, including math and science.
Indeed.
And we have to find ways to get boys interested in reading. Readers' theater. I have one of my MEd students who did something on oratory, the role of oratory, to try and get students to fall in love with reading.
And language, yes.
Yes, and that's critical, because you mentioned a good point. They were saying that Krishna talked about that gap. I remember the Hart and Risley study. Every year when I teach my students, I talk about the Hart and Risley study. That's 30 million word gap compared to children whose parents are educated at university, compared to those parents who come from the lower classes and who may not have benefited from a level of education. That 30 million word gap, as they follow those children, is significant, and it has to come from us ensuring that students are well read, exposing them to varied texts, and getting them to become word conscious, to fall in love with language and make learning interesting. Take away this environment that is so stressed out for children, because that's a big factor.
Focus. Yes. Dr. Seunarinesingh, let me bring you back in here. I see that the university, would again probably be called upon as an intervention into treating with some of the social ills as we talk education, because I also made the linkage between education and poverty, and I'm getting the sense as well, based on what Dr. Skerrit has said, that we haven't really done enough clinical studies, research, and he talked about the view that the girls appear to be doing better than the boys, and that may not necessarily be the case. And it speaks also to the issue of a lack of clinical assessment, clinical research, so that we can get the kind of data. And as you know, once we have that data can in turn drive our policies. Dr. Seunarinesingh.
Yeah, right. So that's an interesting point, and I agree with Paulson on the need for that data. The 2 points. One is that I think that the Ministry of Education probably has pretty strong empirical data to answer that question, yes or no. And where would they get that data? Well, there is the exam, the primary school exam. I'm not sure if it's still on. And then there's one at age 13, the National Secondary School examination. So you can get data there. You can compare boys with girls, but that's just one facet of it. The other source of data and what people in, for example, the Netherlands and Western Europe have been doing in order to quantify the impact of the pandemic is that they had data for, let's say, 2015 to 2020, and they would then compare children test scores there with their test scores when the children returned to school, because their children returned to school.
Right.
Returned to school shortly after returning to school. So they were then able to quantify the gap, and they were then able to say, yes, COVID has had an impact. It is, for example, they were projecting, outside of Trinidad and Tobago, they were projecting that because of the school closure, that in the period between, or the equivalent of our Standard 3 and Form 3, children are going to lose on average 1.5 years, 1.5 years of schooling. Now remember, their children return to school before ours. So ours is probably going to be larger.
Yes. All
right. So the clinical data that you're looking for would be, for example, historically, what's the level of achievement of our students been at, let's just say, Form 3? For the last 5 years, what have they been able to do for the last?
Yes, when you the achievement levels at Form 3, yes.
Yes, the typical Form 3 for the last 5 years, what have they been doing? And if I were to test them in the same period with the current Form 3, where are they? And you then look at it, at the figures. You look to see the whole cohort, which means all the boys and girls. And
we extrapolate, yes.
So you look at the whole cohort compared to the last 5 years, and you could also then drill down and look for how have the boys in the past compared to the boys now, how have the girls in the past compared to the girls now. So that is information that the Ministry of Education already has and can collect. That kind of data, because they do the wide, large-scale testing. I'm not sure you can use the CAPE and CSEC data from 2020 because those were different kinds of exams.
Yes. I think we had an experience, which is a topic of another discussion. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that's a different kind of exam. I don't know. I'm not an assessment expert, and I don't know that I would want to put my neck out in that respect, right? So
yes,
maybe
getting some calls and some emails.
Right.
I know.
but certainly, we need to. One of my major concerns in terms of data we need is what's going to happen for children who are leaving Standard 5 and going into Form 1, or who left Standard 5, and so in terms of our current, we are now in the period where we're going to go into exams, and in September we're going to get these Standard 5 children going into Form 1. And one of the big issues we face is of the difficulty level in the texts that they read. So you are asking a primary child who has not had school for more than a year now, and they're going to make this leap from standard 5 into Form 1. Very different ideas, very different language in the textbooks, lots of different expectations of teachers, and they're going to be expected to know things that they did not get instruction in because of the, remember, if you're in primary school, you're in school from, let's say, 8:30 until 3 o'clock. If you're online, there are stipulations because of mental health issues and the eyes and all that. You cannot engage a child for that length of time.
Fatigue.
It's typical that, right, it's 4 hours or so. So in terms of the curriculum, we are dealing with a much reduced curriculum, and we are now asking those children to jump from standard 5 into Form 1.
And therein lies, Dr. Seunarinesingh, some of the very issues that I referenced earlier on. Obviously, this is going to impact on the level of the university, because these are secondary schools and the private institutions, tertiary level institutions, are really feeder institutions to to university level education. And if you don't have the right cohort of students, or students who have there's the inability to read and to grasp and to understand and to do what I'd call critical thinking, you have an additional challenge at the university level. Dr. Skerrit, you want to come in here? Yeah,
I wanted to comment on that because, as Krishna mentioned, assessing students, knowing where students are is critical. But teachers need to be trained in that assessment. So I think all the teacher training going on now, we need to particularly look at making sure that we prepare teachers to assess and address the learning loss among their students, and to be better able to incorporate digital technology into their teaching. Because now we're realizing that there's a need for teachers to search out our digital resources, digital texts, and to be able to make use of the various integration of technology to engage students, to keep them motivated, so they want to learn. But teachers need to be assessed. Even now, before the pandemic, we were concerned about the kind of intake of students coming into university, and those same areas you mentioned, critical thinking, their writing. Sometimes we're trying to address certain issues, but even the fundamental issue of students writing becomes a challenge, so that you end up spending a lot of time focusing on editing and revising their work, and not really addressing the higher levels of engagement with the concepts that you're addressing. And we constantly hear lecturers talking about that. So that progression from primary into secondary into university, you have to ensure that there's a seamless transition by ensuring the correct preparatory work is done.
Yeah, could I just say something?
Sure.
That earlier you were wondering about and asking about the impact of education and in terms of the policies and all that, and the impact that education has on our developing country. And I mean, one of the success stories that we have had really has been the fact that we have had universal secondary education. The figures tell us that we have a larger number of people at university now than we did previously, right? And we can attribute that to the expansion of our education system, the primary and secondary education system. A lot more children are getting education. But what is worrying here is that you have also a large number of poor children who are receiving packages. So the packages, for those listeners and viewers who don't know, the packages would be, because we are not in school, some children do not have access to laptops or tablets or anything, and therefore teachers have to prepare work. They print it and the school sends it out to the parents, and parents come collect it, and the children read these things at home. There's no direct connection between the teacher and the child. So the teacher cannot call the child and explain something to the child.
Yes. So
what is worrying, you see, is that we know that there have been lots of children who came from very poor circumstances, and I can think of one. I know many years ago there was this child at a rural school, a coastal school, who actually came first in the Caribbean in a business studies subject, right? And she was from a very poor home, single parent, poor home. And my concern is now that we have this disconnect between the teacher and the child is only receiving these packages, what is going to happen to these kids now? These kids who probably could have had an opportunity that the education system would have given them for social mobility, and they could have ended up in university or other tertiary level institution. But now all these kids are getting is sheets of paper, and there's no interaction with the teacher. You have a question, you can't ask the question. You cannot look for help from the teacher. You can't log on to the internet because a lot of them live in areas where there's no running water, there's no electricity.
So there's this disconnect, Dr. Seunarinesingh, and I'm sure that we all can agree that that the in-person learning has more of an impactful, there's more of an impact where you have that sort of physical interaction between teacher and student. You are able to have that sort of a human touch, as it were, and that in itself, we have not had that for over a year, going to 14 months or so, and again, we go back to the issue of the social cost, of what this would eventually pan out to be, in as it relates to our education system. But as we're talking about that as well, we do have ICT, a tool that I believe we can use to leverage, part of the reason that I suppose we have been able to have that increase in enrollment, Dr. Seunarinesingh, that you talked about, is because of ICT. We have been able to create and to have this global village, as it were. We have, I know that the university also offers a lot of online classes as well, from the degrees and diplomas and so that is it that we should be able to leverage in a more forceful way, using ICT to help close that gap, as it were, or is it that we have not found the right formula?
If I could comment on that. Since I came to School of Education, one of the things in the reading course that I've been doing is the focusing on virtual field trips. I was quite pleased when students who fuss about the assignment, because it's a lot of work. It involves using technology creatively to look at issues of reading, look at the content areas, teaching reading across the content areas, and addressing the needs of poor students who can't experience a lot of the field trips to really make connections between the concepts I'm learning and real life and make those applications. But students wrote me and they appreciated the training they got in developing these virtual field trips, because now they were able to really go into the areas that the students couldn't go, but they were able to go get the video, get the audio, talk to the professionals in those areas, and then connect the content with developing literacy skills. So yes, the answer is in using the ICT, but teachers have to do that, integrate it in ways that make sense. It has all the pedagogy of, it's not just the pedagogy of the content, the pedagogy of the use of ICT is important, because you can bring a lot of technology into teaching and then it just becomes busy. It's more a distraction.
It becomes too technological. and out of reach. Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Seunarinesingh, you want to come back in here?
Right. Yeah, I agree with Paulson. Because it can become entertainment.
And that's a danger in itself. Yes,
that's a danger.
And not see it as that valuable and important tool.
Right.
To transition us out of where we are.
Yes. You see, one of the strange things is that, remember, we are training teachers, and so we get invited into people's classrooms through Zoom or Teams or whatever, Google Classroom or something. And the teachers can't see the children unless they ask them to turn on the
camera or webcam. Yes.
Right. And the thing is that, so teachers have to be even more engaging, because they can't see the kids. They can't gauge facial reaction. They don't know whether they're connecting or not. Some of the kids don't talk at all. So sometimes teachers have to try to be captivating and engaging, and you have to say to them, well, let's not make this into a circus show, all right? We don't want to become circus performers. we do have to engage the kids, yes. That's important. But I just wanted to say that if we assume, right, let's assume that everybody had access to the devices. Everybody had connectivity, everybody has a laptop, computer, or desktop, or whatever. They're all logged on, and they're in a classroom. Fact is that it's not just access to the thing. So as Paulson was saying, the teachers need to have the skill. They need to know, I don't just put stuff up on my classroom. It's not a case of going on the internet, searching for something, and bringing it to class. Because we teach teachers, for example, in English, I need to be specific to English, that if you're teaching comprehension tomorrow, you just can't go into the web and say, okay, I'm going to do something on Humanities, let's say, or there, and you choose any passage and you put it and you bring it to the class. You can't say you're teaching a standard 3 and you choose a passage because you like it and you bring it here, because everybody's connected. The fact is that it may not be at the reading level of the children. They may not be interested in it. So there are other considerations that go beyond the presence or absence of these technologies, right? So I think the easiest thing to do is to get the technology. The next easiest thing to do is to train the teachers to use it. That is actually a relatively easy thing to do. A little harder would be to get the teachers to have a philosophy that says, well, teaching online is not actually the same thing as teaching in a classroom. Okay, face to face. That's a little harder.
Yes.
Because some people would teach by just giving a PowerPoint that runs on for 40 minutes and they just lecture. Okay, and they don't make an effort to engage the kids.
Yes.
So they see online teaching as just a online version of face-to-face teaching where the kids are in front of them. Okay, so that's a little harder. A little harder than that would be getting them to recognize that they have to match their resources and their content to the kids in terms of where they are, in terms of their interests and their motivation. That is a little more difficult to teach. So I would say that in terms of the ICT, the thing is, the beautiful thing about this, though as sad as it may be, but still is that for the teachers and the kids who have been online, honestly, it has been a marvelous experience. For the teachers who've been very competent and proficient, they have had access to tools that they did not have and do not have in their schools.
Yes.
So if you're working in a school teaching English or social studies and you wanted to show kids a video on something about somewhere in the world, you had to book.
Yes.
Right. You had to book the AV room, book the projector, book the laptop, all of those things, and you don't necessarily get them on the same day because everybody wants it.
Yes, there are logistical issues that always, always surround those matters.
Yes. Now, when you have your class in your home, you turn it on and it's all before you. So there have been numerous positives for those who have had access. The ICT thing has made a big difference, but there are lots of other issues.
All right, indeed. And you're listening to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. We are talking the state of education in a pandemic. And I have with me Dr. Paulson Skerrit, and also have Dr. Krishna Seunarinesingh of the University of the West Indies. And very, very interesting, engaging discussion at this time. Now, gentlemen, we have about 5 minutes again before we close the program. But before we go further, now, looking at the skills for the 21st century, now, a lot of reports have also come out talking about the 4 C's, and I've noted that particularly, which are communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creative writing and understanding, adaptability. Now, some people have added 2 more to that listing: citizenship and character. Are those critical? Do you see that package being something of critical importance in terms of helping us to drive the education in a direction for which we would like it to go? I know we talked about critical thinking, but I'm seeing where even the issue of citizenship and character building.
Definitely, I think that's critical. Some of the wicked problems, the more wicked problems we have, the way to solve it has to be with a focus on those qualities. You'd realize that in even the very developed countries where they have advanced education, they still have those wicked problems because those things have not been a focus. Even in Trinidad, you look at, I think the last time I was on your radio show, and probably it's a pet peeve of mine, I talk about the way people drive in Trinidad. I live near a four-way stop sign, and many times I can lose my life coming home because people do not stop at the stop signs, and they might say, well, you know, there's no arrangement in our system here for four-way stops, but there's a stop sign system.
Yes.
And STOP needs to stop. You have to come stop. And a human life is something.
By critical analysis, Dr. Paulson, it's self-explanatory. That, as you rightly said, STOP means stop. I'm not sure.
Right.
You know, some people may describe it as a no-brainer. Yeah.
So to addressing those issues of all of those additional C's, I think is critical. We're not thinking critically. The Prime Minister used an expression the other day, don't jackass this thing. And I found it's very, very appropriate because a lot of times the behavior of people, there's this thing that they associate with our culture, and there's no association with our culture. Trinidadians, a lot of us are very gifted, very bright, very well educated, and we have to recognize that this attitude that we can get away with it, if we can get away with it, it's fine, and that has to be part of our education system to ensure that we can think critically, when we read, we don't just accept things, we can analyze that. And that focus is what is going to help us cope with this pandemic.
All right. Again, gentlemen, we are almost at the end of the program. But before we end, Dr. Seunarinesingh and of course, Dr. Skerrit, give us some closing remarks in each, maybe in about 60 seconds or so. We have been talking for the last hour about the state of education in a pandemic, and take us out with some closing remarks. Let me start with Dr. Seunarinesingh.
Yeah, so great. So first, thank you for inviting me and Paulson on the program. And I just want to say that going forward, we know it's going to be a terrible burden on the education system, but that if we have proper dialogue and consensus, that we can find a way out. It is going to be bleak, it is going to be difficult, but I believe that we can manage it. We will have to find a way to deal with the loss. And we at the School of Education stand ready to assist in any way that we can.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Skerrit, some closing remarks.
Yes, I want to point to what we're doing. PEDIC is poised and ready to help. The assessment of students, our reading, we're setting up a reading clinic, and we think that there's going to be a major reading loss. And we want to help. We want parents, we want schools to come to us. We can do whole class assessments and provide the intervention. Because there's that kind of active intervention that needs to take place, and that's why we're setting up this reading clinic, because we know that needs to be addressed. And we're looking forward to parents contacting us, schools contacting us to assess their students. Assessment is critical, and then targeted, sustained intervention.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you both for guesting with us on the Citizens Community Forum. It has been a pleasure for the last hour as we discussed many issues under the topic, the state of education in a pandemic. Dr. Skerrit and Dr. Seunarinesingh, I suspect we may have to continue the discussion because the issues and the problems, sociological, psychological, that we have as we connecting education and other things in society, whether it be work, and there's the issue of the work-life balance as well. There's so much that we haven't gone into this evening, but I'm sure that we would have another opportunity to continue the discussion in this vein.
Sure.
Thank you both again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a famous poet, Martin Niemöller, who once said, "They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. I'm Stephen Cummings. See you next Wednesday.
I'm Dr. Margaret Elcock, President, Founder of LVN Isaac. 2021 is here. The stage is set for a global revival, a mighty move of God transcending all boundaries, all peoples, all nations, as the Church of Jesus Christ unites to fight the forces of darkness in these last and closing days. The battle intensifies, but in the midst of the darkness, the glory of God shines forth as the people worship God in spirit and in truth and in the beauty of holiness. We join with the angels and the elders singing, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Revelation chapter 4:8. The time has come for change. The will of God must be established. His glory must thunder through the atmosphere to infiltrate the airwaves, the media, and all the social media platforms. His voice must be heard. Our location is global, our method virtual, our message consistent and unchanging. We serve the awesome Almighty God Jehovah. We are one in spirit, united in Christ with one vision, one mission, one goal, to go into all the world and make disciples in preparation for his return. Matthew 28:16. We must prepare ourselves with repentance, humility, prayer, and seeking his face for direction so that he will forgive us and heal our nations. 2 Chronicles 7:14. The pandemic has changed our perspective, removed our boundaries, united us in an unprecedented way. We need each other. We are closer together now more than ever before. The time to act is now. Let us wake up, church, and fulfill the purpose for which we have all been called, to take the message of the kingdom to the nations of the earth. Revival 2021 and beyond is a move of God calling the entire body of Christ together to initiate that change. Let us all get on board. FBN, a symbol of strength, stability, innovation, leadership, and authority.
It's not all